When we face a dire situation, it's much easier to run and hide, rather than stand firm and fight against insurmountable odds. Azaghâl, the Lord of Belegost, would have to face such a challenge, though instead of giving up, he chose to rise to the occasion, and his noble actions would become legendary. Hey guys, it's Carl here, and in today's episode, we'll be exploring the story of Azaghâl, the Dwarven King of Belegost. So Azaghâl was the king of the Dwarves of Belegost, and he was born sometime before the year 260 of the First Age. His kingdom was one of the most famous lands of the dwarves, for they were incredibly rich and powerful, and their treasuries contained many precious items. One of Azaghal's most famous artifacts was a great helm that was made out of steel and gold, for it was crafted by Telkar, who was the greatest dwarven smith of Nogrod, and his works included famous weapons such as Narsil and Angrist. This helmet wasn't only beautiful, but it also had a power that protected its user from death and wounds, and any blade that struck it would shatter, and it would turn aside all arrows that hit it. Now one day, while Azaghâl was traveling through the eastern lands of Beleriand, he was attacked by a band of orcs who wished to steal his riches, though luckily they were driven back by an elf lord called Maedhros. Without his help, Azaghâl would have probably been slain by the orcs, and to show his gratitude, he gave Maedhros his great helm in return for saving his life and treasure. This helmet would eventually forge its own famous history as the Dragon Helm of Dor-Lomin, though that is a story for another time. Now in the year 468, Maedhros would feel that the time was ripe to challenge Morgoth and to attack his fortress of Angband, and he would summon the various factions of the Free People to join his alliance. Azaghâl had not forgotten the help that Maedhros had given him, and he would answer his call to arms, and he rallied many of the Dwarves of Belegost as they prepared for war, and their halls were filled with the sound of hammers and forgework as they stockpiled weapons and armor. The Free People managed to assemble one of their greatest hosts, and it included elves, dwarfs and men, and even some of the Easterlings. Together they drove back Morgoth's forces after a hard-fought battle, and they laid siege to Angband, and for a moment it seemed like their victory was possible, before Morgoth emptied his fortress and unleashed all of his forces upon them. There were orcs, wolves, balrogs and dragons, and the greatest of these was Glaurung. His strength and power were terrible to behold, and he was so great that none of the elves and men could stand before him, and he swept aside the hosts of the Free People. To make matters worse, the Free People were betrayed by some of their Easterling allies who were secretly in the service of Morgoth, and their defeat now seemed imminent. They tried to desperately cut a path through their enemies to avoid total annihilation, and for a moment it seemed like their attempt to escape was futile, and that Glaurung and the rest of the dragons would massacre them, though they would manage to avoid this horrible fate thanks to the Dwarves of Belegost. For while the elves and men fled, Azaghâl and his people stayed behind, standing firm against this onslaught, and their great dwarven masks helped them to resist the fires of the dragons. Azaghâl would lead his warriors, and together they surrounded Glaurung, hacking away at his hide, though not even their mighty axes could pierce his scales. Nonetheless, these attacks enraged Glaurung, and he turned quickly and struck down Azaghâl, before he crawled over his body. As Azaghâl lay dying, with this hideous dragon bearing upon him, he summoned all of his strength to drive a knife deep into Glaurung's belly, which was his weak spot, and this injury drove Glaurung into a mad frenzy and he fled from the battlefield, with many of the beasts of Angband in his trail. Azaghal's final deed had saved the Free People from a terrible onslaught, though it came at the cost of his life, and the Dwarves of Belegost surrounded the body of their fallen king, and they raised him up in honor. As they slowly bore him away, they sang an elegy for their lord, and they ignored all of their enemies, and no one dared to attack or stop them. In my opinion, Azaghal's story makes him one of the greatest dwarfs that ever lived, and we shouldn't underestimate his sacrifice. He saved many of his allies from a terrible fate, and they would live to fight another day. And without this sacrifice, I doubt that the Free People would have managed to resist Morgoth for much longer. How do you guys feel about his character and sacrifice? And can you think of any other dwarf that surpassed his deeds? As always, I'd really like to thank my patrons. You guys really helped to make this channel possible. and I deeply appreciate your support, especially my Wizard-Tier patrons: Jacob Williams, Michelangelo, T-Gorman, James Tugel, Mike Feeney, Roland Mervold, Jeremy Pontier, and Big Boy. If you too would like to help and support this channel while unlocking some cool perks, I'll be leaving a link to my Patreon page in the video description. You can also support this channel by checking out our store and by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and joining our Discord server. You can find all of these links in the video description. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to join our fellowship today. I hope to see you all in my next video, where together we'll once again explore the magical world and lore of Middle-earth.